Oh, here we go. All right, there we go. I think there was just I think that there's glitches all around today. For those who are popping in here, welcome, welcome. I'm going to do a quick pulse check. I'm going to launch this poll, and while you guys are waiting, while I do some intros, let's find out what you guys are doing here. Hope everyone's having a great day so far. My name is Amanda Farina. Welcome everybody to our webinar here at Prevalent, Managing Third-Party Risks Throughout the Supplier Lifecycle. I will be your host today, but we have a great panel. We have Michael Rasmussen from the Analyst and GRC Pundit at C up top there, GRC 2020. That's all him. We have another special guest, Toby Emden, VP of Product Strategy and Innovation at SecZeta. There's the gorgeous brand up there as well, and our very own Scott Lang, VP of Product Marketing here at Prevalent, and as you can see, our logo is there as well. We're very excited for everyone to join us. Obviously, we want to know what brought you here. A couple of housekeepings. You guys are all muted, so we won't hear you, but please keep it interactive. We're going to have a Q&A at the end. There's a Q&A on the bottom. There's a chat if you guys want to leave a comment or whatever it is, but let's get those questions answered. So please utilize that. We have a great panel, great session. You'll hear from everybody, Scott and Toby towards the end, but Michael will be really carrying this. So we're very excited to have everyone. I think that's it from me. I'll end this poll, and Michael, I'll let you take it away.
Certainly. It is an absolute pleasure to be here once again at Prevalent and talking about one of the most significant challenges organizations face in context of governance, risk management, and compliance. And that's managing your third-party risks, the extended enterprise throughout the supplier lifecycle. Think about it. Today's modern organization, half of the organization is no longer defined by traditional employees and brick and mortar walls. We have the extended enterprise of contractors, consultants, outsourcers, service providers, suppliers, vendors, brokers, agents, dealers, intermediaries, temporary workers, and more. Today's modern organization relies on the extended enterprise of third-party relationships. If we weren't in lockdowns right now, and we were back in the corporate office in places, and some of us are starting to get there, already. But if we're back in the corporate offices, half the people you walk by are not traditional employees, but they're third parties. Half the people in the conference rooms are third parties these days, and so we need to be able to manage third-party risk throughout the life cycle. But let's get started here. And so just as I was already illustrating, today's business is what I call navigating chaos, because we cannot define where the organization starts and stops anymore. It is no longer, as I've already stated, defined by brick and mortar walls and traditional employees. The modern organization is the extended enterprise, and we have to be able to understand and monitor a range of risks across that. But it is at the same time that we're having the extended enterprise to be able to manage, we have significant changes in regulations. There's a lot that impact third parties. As we outsource and contract with third parties, our compliance obligations we're accountable for, and we need to make sure there's proper responsibility within the third parties. You cannot outsource accountability. And so at the end of the day, when it comes to regulatory compliance risks in third-party relationships, the organization remains accountable. If there is an issue of compliance, whether it's privacy compliance, conduct, bribery and corruption, whatever it might be, the organization's accountable. That's the difference between accountability and responsibility. You can outsource responsibility and give tasks to third parties, to other people, but you cannot outsource accountability. So we have volumes of regulatory change that the organization is accountable for, and we need to make sure that those compliance requirements and things are being met in third-party relationships. We have changes in the risk environment and what's accepted industry practices, geopolitical risks, economic risks, shifts in technology that impact not only our organization, but our third-party relationships as well. We have changes in internal business and employees and the use of relationships. And it's just as much as our business is changing, our third parties are changing as well. And we have to be able to understand that maybe they are the right person to do business with 3 years ago when we established that relationship, but it does not necessarily mean that they're the right company to have a relationship with today, because their business has changed and evolved. we have to be able to see all the and navigate a lot of change and impacts and really fuzzy lines as we get into the extended enterprise and nested supply chains and subcontracting relationships. This is at the heart of what I call navigating chaos. Next, we need to be able to understand the tree as well as the forest, that individual third-party relationship and the interconnectedness of relationships, that individual risk and the interconnectedness of risks. From the risk standpoint, you look at COVID-19 and it shows the cascading interconnected risk environment that impacts our third-party relationships. It starts off with the health and safety risk, and we have to ensure and do assessments across our third-party relationships of their health and safety to ensure resiliency of the organization as we rely on third-party relationships, to cascade to other risks, such as bribery and corruption risks. The majority, if you look at the U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and the enforcement actions from the SEC and DOJ, as well as other regions like the UK with the UK Bribery Act and CEP and DO in France, the majority of bribery enforcement actions, the anti-bribery and corruption like US FCPA, the majority of them involve a third party of some nature. And because of COVID-19, to show the interconnected risk environment, we have restrictions on customs and import and export of goods. We have limited contracts and permits. We're at a heightened environment where some third-party agent of the organization might bribe a foreign government official, exposing us to FCPA enforcement or other things. We have increased risk of modern slavery because of COVID-19. As our third-party factories and things are devastated by the pandemic in certain parts of the world, they might be staffing those factories with child labor and forced labor, introducing modern slavery risk issues to the organization, which impacts brand and reputation. There's resiliency risks and so much more. It's an interconnected risk environment, and we have to see the tree of risk as well as the forest of risk, but we have to see that individual relationship and the interconnectedness of relationships. Now, when there's no global pandemic, I present this slide around the world in my third-party GRC management by design workshops. And interesting enough, I've had a comment on this slide from two different companies, both global banks, in two different cities, one in San Francisco and one in London. They said the same thing on this slide. Great analogy, but the reality is in our organization, it's not just the tree and the forest, but it's the leaves and the branches. We have to understand not only the relationship and the risks in that relationship at a relationship level, but we actually have to understand the risks in delivery and the objectives down at the tree and the branch level, or the facility level, the contract, the service level agreement. That all becomes absolutely critical as well. I sat on the Social Accountability Advisory Board for a major Fortune company a while back. And they had 5,000 suppliers with 20,000 facilities in their global supply chain. And it was a social accountability program. So it was dealing with supply chain code of conduct and international labor standards like child labor, forced labor, working hours, wage an hour. And these things were not just measured at the relationship level, the tree level, but also that leaf and the branch level, the facility level. Again, there's 5,000 trees, 5,000 suppliers, but there's 20,000 branches, 20,000 facilities. One supplier might have one facility, another supplier might have 50 facilities. And this Fortune company, was monitoring risk ongoing year after year throughout the life cycle, down at that facility level, not just the supplier level. So we need to get down to the trees and the branches as well. So the challenge I find in a lot of programs that I interact with on this in my research is that the challenge is, can you attest to the governance, risk, and compliance of the organization's extended business relationships? You look at the array of your third-party relationships across suppliers, vendors, outsourcers, service providers, contractors, consultants, temporary workers, brokers, agents, dealers, intermediaries, and such. Are each of those relationships properly governed to reliably achieve the objectives in the relationship? Are we managing the risk and uncertainty in the relationship, and ensuring the integrity of the relationship around compliance and reputational issues? The typical response that I see in organizations is that they tend to look at the formation of a third-party relationships during the onboarding phase, but fail to foresee and monitor the risks that cascade and cause damage to reputation throughout the ongoing life cycle of the relationship. Organizations need to be able to manage their risk across the overall life cycle of the relationship, from the onboarding to the offboarding. But the risks organizations face are many. Another issue I see in a lot of third-party risk programs is that they've defined them, around a specific area, like IT risk, information security or privacy risk. But the scope of third-party risks is much, much broader than that. We've got conduct risk in dealing with vendor and supply chain code of conduct, and dealing with, making sure that people share the same values and commitments that we do. We got the challenges of operational resiliency and viability. Is that third party one that is going to stand the test of time and be financially viable and be able to deliver? Or is there a risk of them going out of business? What is the operational resiliency, issues? Do we have redundant supply chains, or do we have, single points of failure in our supply chain? Those are all to be considered. You've got privacy risks. If you look at the Ponemon Institute, the cost of a data breach, the average cost of a data breach in an organization is, I think, $3.89 million. But if it involves a third party, it escalates about 4.12 or something, I think, like that, $1 million. The cost of a data breach when it involves a third party is higher. But the interesting thing is the slight majority of data breaches involve a third party. And we have a significant exposure of privacy, whether it's this EU's GDPR, California CCPA, South Africa's recently enforced, POPI, the personal, I'm going to get all wrong, personal information, the Privacy Act down in South Africa. You got all the privacy issues around the world, Australia's Privacy Act and more. You've got information security concerns in the third-party relationships. And these are getting front and center attention. With things like the SolarWinds breach, in which basically a Trojan horse was installed in software, a backdoor that compromised hundreds to potentially even thousands of organizations that use that software, a third-party relationship in that case. And you look at me, look around me right now. The speaker in front of me is connected to the internet. The TV behind me is connected to the internet. My exercise bike is connected to the internet. My blender in my kitchen's connected to the internet. I can program it with my iPhone. I have no idea why I'd want to program my blender with my iPhone, but I could. If any of these devices had a Trojan horse backdoor installed, it can compromise my home office network. And as I'm a third party to and provide advice and consulting to organizations around the world, I might have their data on my laptop or connection to their network, and that exposes them. So just as the work from home environment and the security of the work from home environment is a concern for your employees, it's also a concern for the third parties that support you and have your data as well, and connections to your environment. Information security is absolutely critical in the Internet of Things. And we've seen compromises of this before, not just with SolarWinds, but there was the casino breach in the United Kingdom not too long ago, in which hackers broke into a fish tank thermometer. I've also heard a video camera. I've heard two stories there, but was able to compromise, data and gain access to all the data of the customers at the casino. Internet of Things is real, and the information security is a concern. It was, several years ago, we had the Target breach, where the doorway there was an HVAC vendor, heating and air conditioning vendor, had a connection to the Target network for environmental monitoring. That heating and air conditioning vendor was targeted and compromised, and they were able then, the hackers, to get into the Target network and compromise point of sale systems. So information security, anti-bribery and corruption. U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, UK Bribery Act, SEP and DO in France, and many, many more. The majority of anti-bribery and corruption enforcement actions involve third-party relationships that act as agents, dealers, intermediaries in negotiating with foreign government agents and things. Significant issues and exposure, particularly coming out of COVID-19, with limited government contracts and permits and a lot of competition for them. But now, good night, we've got ESG, environmental social governance. What used to be called corporate social responsibility or sustainability, we now have ESG. And wake up, pay attention. Significant changes are happening this year in the context of the extended enterprise. This is absolutely significant. If you look at the EU directive on corporations due diligence, and you look at the corresponding German law on the Corporations Due Diligence Act, this is going to have a bigger impact than GDPR ever had. And GDPR has had a huge impact. You know, I talked to an Illinois bank, a bank that's just in one city in the state of Illinois that had to be GDPR compliant because they had 2 customers that were European citizens. You know, that's significant. You know, but now with the new EU directive and the corresponding country laws are coming about, like Germany's law, it's going to require organizations to have any footprint in Europe, even a small footprint in Europe. You're going to have to, be addressing significant ongoing and continuous due diligence around environmental, social, and governance aspects of your third-party relationships. This is absolutely going to be huge as this law comes into effect, and it's going to completely shift third-party risk management programs out there that have predominantly focused a lot on information security. There's going to be a predominant focus going forward on the ESG aspects because of this. And that impacts that area of environmental and social and accountability and human rights areas, where you've got like the EU directive and Germany's law, but you got the UK Modern Slavery Act, you have California's Transparency and Supply Chains Act, you got Australia's Slavery Act, you've got conflict minerals in the US and more. You've got health and safety issues in our third-party relationships, dealing with sanctions and making sure you're not dealing with organizations and entities and individuals that are blacklisted from being able to work with from a government perspective. Challenges in import and export and traceability of minerals. There's a wide range of third-party risks. And my point in today's particular webinar is a lot of times we come in, we measure that third-party relationship during the onboarding process, and we decide whether we move forward or not with that relationship, but we fail to monitor all these risks throughout the life cycle of the relationship. And that vendor or supplier or outsourcer or whoever it might be might have done all the right things 3 years ago, but that doesn't mean that they have the same operations and processes and employees and integrity today. And we have to be able to monitor these risks on a continuous and ongoing basis in the organization. Failure in third-party governance comes about when organizations have growing risk and regulatory concerns with inadequate resources. I'm finding a lot of organizations are ending up managing documents and spreadsheets and emails and not really managing third-party risk. And one organization I talked to, a mid-sized bank, found that 80% of their staff time internally in different areas of compliance and risk was nothing more than document reconcilers. 80% of their staff time was managing documents, not managing risk. Another firm I talked to was spending 200 employee hours to build a report for the board of directors on compliance. That's significant. One petroleum company I talked to with about 5,000 suppliers went from 6 FTEs, six full-time equivalent employees, to manage conflict minerals, and that was how much it was taking them in document spreadsheets and emails, down to 1 FTE when they automated with technology. You got interconnected third-party risks that aren't connected in evaluation. And organizations want to be able to see a 360-degree contextual view of risk into these third-party relationships. Because right now in the past, we got silos of risk oversight. IT security is using this solution and they're evaluating third-party risk. Corporate compliance and ethics is using, document spreadsheets and emails and evaluating third-party risk. Procurement's looking at the financial viability of third-party relationships, and they're using some other solution. And everybody has their little blinders on, and maybe information security scores risk as a yellow. Let's use a simple stoplight diagram of red, yellow, green. So medium, yellow. Maybe corporate compliance and ethics, looking at bribery and corruption and conduct of third parties, scores it as a yellow. Maybe the procurement group scores it as a yellow. Do we have enough yellows where our aggregate risk exposure is actually a red? It's something to think about. We need to be able, when we look at managing risk throughout the life cycle of the supply chain relationship, we need to be able to see the aggregate risk exposure across these different risk areas. So that interconnected third-party risks that are not connected goes into the silos of third-party oversight that's just looking under those specific silos of risk. The document and email-centric approaches I've talked about. We have scattered and non-integrated legacy third-party risk technologies that are just used for very specific risk areas, and nobody's seen that big picture again. We have processes that are focused on onboarding only and not throughout the ongoing, execution and delivery of the relationship. We have inadequate processes to manage change internally within our business, but also within our third parties. We have third-party performance evaluations that neglect to really measure risk and compliance in those as well. Well, overall, if you listen to what I've stated, we have the inevitability of failure in third-party risk when we try to rely on third-party risk assessments that are encumbered by siloed solutions that only focus on one area of risk, as well as document spreadsheets and emails that encumber the organization and bury it, where third-party risk professionals are document managers and not risk managers. And so we're moving from a past to a future. From a past where there's different departments and silos managing third-party risk without collaborating with each other, to a future of a federated and integrated third-party risk program. We're moving from a past where there's a lot of responsibilities for third-party risk that are passed around like a hot potato, to a future of structured accountability for third-party risk and enforcement and oversight and board-level communication and accountability. We're moving from a past of a lot of documents, spreadsheets, and emails to a future of integrated technology to deliver and monitor the third-party risk throughout the supplier relationship. This gets me into the definition of what I call third-party GRC management. A lot of you watching this webinar, either live or on demand, might call it third-party risk management, and I understand that. But I would argue with you that it's more. It's about the governance of the relationship and the risk and the compliance of the relationship. Third-party risk is in the middle, and we need to be able to govern the relationships. Third-party GRC management is a capability that enables an organization to govern, to reliably achieve the objectives in the relationship, to manage risk, which is addressing the uncertainty in the relationship, and act with integrity, the compliance, in and across all of its third-party relationships. Governance, that's where it starts, with integrated governance of third-party relationships, being able to monitor the relationships across your extended enterprise, to be able to ensure that they are meeting the objectives and purpose of the relationship for which it was established and returning value to the organization. Once we understand the objectives, we can understand risk, which is the uncertainty of the relationship. In fact, ISO 31000 says risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. We have the objectives established under governance. Risk is measuring the uncertainty to achieve those objectives. And that's what risk management's about. Understanding the governance objectives of the relationship gives us context to be able to assess, analyze, and monitor the uncertainty and risk in the relationship. Each relationship has its objectives, and uncertainty needs to be managed and monitored against those objectives. Compliance then aims to see that the organization acts with integrity in its relationships. Integrity in fulfilling its regulatory, contractual, and self-imposed obligations like ESG commitments, values, ethics, across its third-party relationships. Compliance follows through on risk treatment plans to assure that risk is being managed within limits and controls are in place. So my question before you today, how are you approaching third-party GRC management, or what you might call third-party risk management? Is it disconnected departments managing third-party relationships in different ways? Many focus on just the onboarding process and then neglecting it throughout the life cycle of the relationship? Or do you have a federated third-party GRC management program where there's an integrated approach across different business areas of procurement, corporate compliance and ethics, legal, information security, health and safety, and more? That you have this integrated approach across these departments that balances third-party GRC management centralization with the distributed participation and collaboration across these departments. This means different departments need to work together in a common strategy, process, and technology architecture. It starts with that top-level third-party management strategy, dealing with the charter and the vision and mission and how these different departments and functions work together and come together and who leads that strategy, to defining our third-party management processes, which we're talking about today in the next several slides, and looking at the managing risk throughout the life cycle of the relationship, our onboarding processes, our ongoing monitoring processes, our offboarding processes. And what's the information technology architecture that can support the strategy and processes of the organization? So from one perspective, here's a third-party management life cycle. It starts with onboarding. And we do our extensive due diligence and making sure there's proper financial viability in the third-party relationship, that there's proper monitoring of the information security controls and validation of the potential third-party relationship, and that the third party is not engaged with any politically exposed persons that might lead to issues of bribery and corruption. We checked our negative news and our brand lists, reputation brand lists and things to ensure that it's the right relationship to do business with, all part of the onboarding phase. Then we go into the ongoing monitoring, in which we evaluate the relationship on an ongoing process to make sure it's reliably achieving the objectives of the relationship, as well as monitoring the risk and exposure of the relationship. We go into maintenance and renewal, where the contract comes to an end and we renew that contract and engagement with the relationship. And at some point, we say goodbye to the relationship and offboarding. Throughout this life cycle, we have to be able to manage risk and compliance throughout it, the performance and objectives, conduct audits and inspections where necessary, and manage and resolve the issues that might come up in the relationship. That's a high-level snapshot. We'll unpack this a little bit more. But some critical elements of a third-party GRC strategic plan is to be able to understand performance and risk in the relationship. We're not just monitoring risk, we're monitoring the objectives of the relationship and making sure that the relationship's delivering the value for the very purpose that the relationship was established in the organization. We want to be able to approach third-party GRC in proportion to the risk exposure of the relationship. We need proper support, tone at the top of the organization, to be able to manage and monitor risk in the extended enterprise. We need to clearly know who we do business with, not just during onboarding, but how that business evolves and changes throughout the life cycle of the relationship. We need to keep our information current in our evaluation and assessment of third parties, have proper third-party governance and oversight with established policies and procedures and effective training, communication, and engagement of internal third-party relationship owners, but also of the third parties themselves. Implement communication and reporting processes to be able to measure and report on risk to the relationship owners and the line of business and executives. Provide ongoing assessment and monitoring, investigations, controls, audits, and inspections, and keep all this current in a very dynamic, changing business environment. So we need to build our third-party GRC management program. And in that context, it starts with understanding and clearly defining our goals for the program. And those goals, I think, are clearly defined in the definition of GRC that I gave you, to reliably achieve the objectives in each relationship, manage uncertainty in and across each relationship, and the integrity of the relationships. From there, we need to be able to segment our different types of audiences. When we think of who our third parties are, there's differences in geography in the risk that different third parties bring, and in the type of relationship. Is this a supplier? And what type of supplier? Is this an outsourcer, a vendor, service provider, contractor, consultant, temporary worker? What will they be given access to? Is it critical? All these are questions to consider in segmenting and defining our audience and being able to understand risk exposures. What's the proper resources and staff and technology that we need? How do we make the third-party GRC program accessible? Are we dealing with a lot of third parties that have English as a second language or might not even speak English at all? How do we deal with, the language and accessibility needs across the extended enterprise? How do we define KRIs and key KPIs for the overall third-party GRC management program, but also each relationship as well, the key performance indicators and key risk indicators? How do we align our assessments and work together across different departments and functions? And where do we report with internal stakeholders and have proper executive support for the program? This means that we have to have a core GRC, third-party GRC management program that has the components to identify, monitor, assess, and reevaluate risk throughout the life cycle of the relationship. That's looking at the risks in the relationship, but also in context of the value that relationship's bringing to the organization. Let's look at these four elements here. It starts with the identify, where we need to be able to identify the different third parties out there, their contracts and contact information. We need to be able to map the internal relationships, who owns those relationships of the third parties, and provide relevant triggers for alerts or changes in those relationships and measure risk exposure and level of control based on the relationship and the risk in that relationship. From there, we move on to monitor. Here, we want to be able to clearly understand, again, the contracts and contact information and who owns the relationship. We also need to understand what are the compliance requirements within the contract, whether they're regulatory requirements or requirements that we put into the contract as well, different controls and things. And how do we monitor changes to the risk environment, regulatory obligations, and business changes that impact how that relationship is executed in the environment? This might require annual certifications and attestations to policies and training, monitoring, ongoing monitoring transactions like gift and entertainment, hospitality, and political contribution expenses to them that might trigger, something that's being given to a third party that can be bribery and corruption related. You've got to be able to monitor the people involved, like politically exposed persons in a third party relationship, location and geographies that are hotspots for maybe child labor, forced labor, bribery and corruption, or other issues around the world. Even resiliency and supply chain issues are important there as we look around the world and look at things like the shortage in semiconductors and everything else that we've seen right now, the backage of ships at the Suez Canal, that's impact. To even the shortage of shipping containers and things because everything's been shipped to remote parts of the world, like personal protective equipment. And now those shipping containers are stuck overseas, so we have a shortage on that. We need to be able to monitor all these different types of things in the environment on an ongoing basis. And then from there, we need to be able to assess the risk. Assess risk and compliance, the performance against service level agreements and key performance indicators. We need to be able to identify internal and external events and changes like geopolitical risks and disruptions to our business, maybe increased enforcement actions in privacy or increased enforcement actions in ESG, like environmental social governance that we're starting to see, as I referenced in Europe, or bribery and corruption, whatever it might be, and measure the effectiveness of our third-party risk program over time. From there, it gets into the reevaluation of the program. So we need to reevaluate the contract provisions and controls. Think about it. The world's changed. The world's constantly changing. Our contract with that third party from 10 years ago might not have the right provisions and controls in it to meet the risks today. Technology's changed. 10 years ago, we didn't have the Internet of Things, and that's such a big concern. We have so much risk exposure coming at us at a fast velocity that we need to reevaluate our contracts, provisions, and controls on a regular basis to make sure that they're still the right ones. We need to be able to constantly monitor, is that third party still the right one to be doing business with, and manage investigations. So I'm going to unpack this a little bit further. So I'm getting a little more detailed each time I go through this. So, this is all, these next several slides are found in my third-party GRC Management by Design paper. That's on my website. It's free out there. There's no charge for it. There's a lot of detail in it. But we're going to go through 7 steps of managing risk throughout the supplier lifecycle. The first one is the ongoing context monitoring. So even before we look at the third parties themselves, we need to understand our business. That's what the ongoing context monitoring is about, where we have an ongoing monitoring of our business structure, to be able to monitor the external risk environment of geopolitical risks and regulatory risks and business risks, our internal risk environment. We need to understand our business inside and outside, internal pressures and external pressures, to be able to properly structure a supplier risk lifecycle management. The purpose is to identify opportunities as well as risks and regulatory requirements that are evolving and shifting and changing and impact the overall third-party management program. So, for example, ongoing context monitoring today, most of you on the phone, our web, are going to want to be paying close attention to what's going on in Europe. With the EU directive and Germany's corresponding law on the Corporations Due Diligence Act. This is going to have a global impact. And if you have any play in Europe for customers or presence, employees, whatever it might be, you're going to have to pay attention to it. This is serious business. So, this is ongoing context monitoring because you're monitoring for the developments around the world, what's happening. We're 18 months ago, hopefully most of us were monitoring, what's happening with COVID-19 and starting to prepare should COVID-19 start to spread. Many of us were not and were caught off guard. And so that caught us by surprise. Ongoing context monitoring is about understanding the world around us, the geopolitical risks, the regulatory risks, how our business operates structured, the strategy where it's headed, so that we can adjust and be proactive in adjusting our third-party risk program to meet the changes happening in the environment around us. But then we get into the individual third-party life cycle, the supplier life cycle. This starts with the third-party identification and onboarding. This is the collection of processes aimed at automation of and standardization and an objective approach for identifying third parties to work with, onboarding them through the collection of third-party data and conducting the appropriate initial due diligence. I say initial because then we're getting into ongoing due diligence. And so as we establish each relationship, we should establish the purpose and identification of the relationship, the categorization of the relationship, what type of relationship it is. Qualification, is this a third party we can be doing business with? So part of that screening process might indicate a sanction issue or a politically exposed person issue, or many other issues that might pop up. Then we move into the contracting and negotiation phase and registration and onboarding of the third party relationship. From there, we move into the third party communications and attestations. These are the set of ongoing continuous processes to manage the communications and interactions with the third party throughout the relationship's life cycle. These are done on a periodic, such as annual basis, or when certain risk conditions are triggered. And so we might require on an annual basis that every third party reads the supply chain and vendor code of conduct. We might require that every third party answers some survey risk assessment questionnaire and gather that information, on their information security practices and compliance and other practices. These are done on a periodic basis, but we also need to be able to conduct these on some type of triggered basis. And so maybe bribery and corruption is the hot thing. And in fact, if you're paying attention in the US, the Biden administration has put a lot of emphasis on revamping and extending, the enforcement of bribery and corruption just in the past couple of weeks. So that's that ongoing context monitoring outside the environment, which means that, hey, that might trigger that we should reevaluate our third parties in this area and make sure that proper understanding of gifts, entertainment expenses to third parties, and hospitality and political contributions and facilitated payments and all these different policies are properly understood in the organization as they involve third parties. So as there's increased enforcement, maybe, one of our significant competitors is under investigation by the Department of Justice or the SEC, or there's an announcement like from the Biden administration is we're cracking down in this area. That might be a trigger that requires some type of assessment and evaluation of our third parties outside the context of the periodic, such as annual basis. These third-party communications and attestations involve third-party communications and reminders on policies like supply chain code of conduct, privacy policies, security policies, training. I was talking to, this is about 2 years ago, or 18 months ago, I was talking to a global European bank in Switzerland. They're looking at having everybody in their data centers go through the same privacy policies that their employees do. The key thing is everybody in their data centers. Most of the people in their data centers are not employees. They are third parties. They are contractors, consultants, outsourcers, and service providers. Those individuals within those third parties have to go through the same policies and training that employees do on GDPR. That training. When I was with that on the Social Accountability Advisory Board for that major Fortune 100 company, on an annual basis, every facility, not just the relationship level. Again, there's with that particular situation, there's 5,000 relationships, 5,000 suppliers, but 20,000 facilities. Each relationship at the facility level had to annually, at least one individual at the facility level had to go through the supply chain code of conduct and through the training on the supply chain code of conduct on an annual basis. So policy communications and training, attestation that the third party is meeting the requirements, the self-assessments and the surveys and questionnaires, and reporting on this. That moves us to the fourth stage, third-party monitoring and assessment. This stage includes the array of processes to continuously monitor the third-party relationship over their life cycle in the organization. These activities are the ones typically done with the organization to monitor and assess the third-party relationship on an ongoing basis. This involves continuous due diligence. Remember, we did due diligence when we onboarded the relationship. So that includes politically exposed persons, watch lists, sanction lists, negative news, financial viability, security ratings, all these different elements. That needs to be done on a regular, periodic basis and hopefully continuous basis, where it's like weekly or nightly, we're going against these third-party database checks. We need clear processes to identify issues, report and resolve them, monitor performance in third-party relationship and risk and compliance, and how to conduct audits and inspections. One firm that I interacted with, tiered their right to audit clauses, their inspections. High-risk third parties in certain areas had an on-site inspection every year. Those are the ones that had a high significant risk of exposure to the organization. Medium risk facilities, moderate risk, had an on-site inspection every 2 years. And low risk facilities, ones that really didn't bring much risk, sort of had random audits and inspections. That moves us to forms and approvals. This is a set of internal processes to collect and report information and route things for approval in context of third-party relationships, such as new vendor supplier request forms, gifts, hospitality, entertainment forms, political and charitable contributions, facilitated payments, and more. That brings us to metrics and reporting, which is the process to gather metrics and report on third-party relationships at the relationship level, as well as in the aggregate level across relationships, like geographic reporting by groups of relationships and categories of relationships. And then you have the third-party reevaluation, the process that needs to be put in place to evaluate, maintain, renew, and offboard relationships. So relationship renewal, as well as offboarding and retirement. And then the offboarding is where I find most organizations completely fail abysmally. That they have the onboarding piece down, they're starting to get some of the middle components of the ongoing monitoring right, but they haven't addressed how do we terminate a relationship properly. All this means that we need to provide strong 360-degree contextual intelligence on these relationships that can take in distributed and disconnected third-party data points, understand and map these contextually together, and build out action items in the organization on how to address this. It means we need strong technology, that our internal staff aren't third-party document managers, but they're truly third-party risk managers. Again, I referenced that one mid-sized bank I worked with, on an RFP. 80% of their staff time was managing documents and only 20% actually managing risk. And they wanted to flip that around, where only 20% of their time was actually reconciling information and 80% was actually improving risk in the organization for third parties and more. So we need strong management reporting, where that reports are there at a dashboard and click at a button. There's strong audit trail and system of record of activities of who did what, when, how, and why. Workflow and tasks to make sure things don't slip through the cracks. Collaboration between different departments like procurement, information security, legal, corporate compliance, and ESG and others. Monitoring of enforcement of controls and audits, inspections, and assessments of the relationship as well. The benefits of approaching this is an agile third-party program that provides 360-degree contextual awareness of our risks in a changing dynamic business environment that is constantly trying to navigate chaos. This allows us to see the interconnections of risk, to be able to work together and align our program, to be more responsive so that we can respond to changes in the business as well as the regulatory and risk environment that impact our third parties, to therefore be agile to navigate a risk environment, to use it to our benefit and not our curse. But bad things will happen, which means that we also need to be resilient so that we can bounce back quickly from third-party events that happen, as well as be efficient in our use of human capital and financial capital resources. So with that, I'd like to turn this back over to our host today to hear some of their perspectives.
Hey, Michael, thank you so much for your presentation. Hi, everybody. My name is Scott Lang, VP of Product Marketing here at Prevalent. It's my pleasure to be talking with you today. Michael just handed down some pretty practical and significant guidance on expanding the scope and management of third-party risk governance and management across the supplier lifecycle. I just want to take 3 minutes and share with you how we put that into practice at Prevalent, and then we'll hand it off to our partners at Sexata, who can explain how that impacts third-party identity management challenges as well. So if you kind of diagram, Michael's presentation across, his 7 steps, I think it fits pretty neatly with how we approach the market as well. Our first step in the process is about sourcing and selection. Giving good credence and time to assessing your own internal practices, but then identifying the mechanisms and processes and ways that it can help to inform better vendor selection and better third-party selection. That's all about reducing the cost and risk when sourcing new vendors. Do they have the right policies in place? Do they have the right insights and monitoring intelligence? And do you have a good grasp of their financial exposures and credit histories and things like that? Getting the right vendors onboarded means getting the right picture of their risks across multiple different variables. The second step of our process is all about simplifying the intake and onboarding process, or accelerating it while making sure that that you're ensuring security across the life cycle. That's really the second step in the process: finding a vendor, sourcing them; second, bringing them on board. And from our approach, that means extending the ability to contribute to vendor management to multiple different departments. Not just the IT security team, which is probably the one set of folks in your organizations that manage the core risk assessment capabilities, but also ensuring that internal audit and compliance audit and procurement teams and sourcing teams also have access to contribute to the single body of risk management knowledge that's housed in a single system, so everybody can contribute to it, see the data through the life cycle. Third processes, or third part of the process is, we've sourced a good vendor, we've got them intook. I don't know what the past tense of that is. I just invented that. You intook a vendor, and you've onboarded them. And now you're performing some level of inherent risk scoring to set a baseline of what types of assessment actions you should take based on the insights that you have about that vendor. All right, so sourced, onboarded, and then some inherent risk scoring to make good risk-based decisions and give some visibility. Next, you really get into the core assessment and remediation of discovered risks stage. So that inherent risk assessment is going to give you some guidance on the proper domains, if you will, that you have to assess those third parties on, based on whether or not they're a critical supplier, tier 1 supplier, essential for operations, critical for infrastructure, and more. And asking those types of questions is going to give you a single risk register of intelligence that you can raise risks from. You can take remediative action on if there's something that doesn't align with your definition of acceptable risk tolerance levels. And then with two-way integration, or two-way dialogue rather, between you and your third parties, you can partner together to reduce everyone's risk profile. But as Michael mentioned, it's not just about that annual risk assessment or the one time a year, maybe it's a year, maybe it's more or less frequently, the one time a year assessment of your third parties. It's also filling the gaps between those assessments with some continuous cyber risk monitoring, reputational monitoring, and then financial and credit updates as well, to kind of make sure that you've got some continuous insight into what may be impacting those third parties. For example, a visit from an OSHA, for a factory violation, maybe a bad quarter caused them to maybe lay off a few employees, which could impact service. Getting that level of visibility can kind of help you stay on top of vendor developments, make good decisions at that maintenance level of the relationship. Next step is all about measuring SLAs and performance. And this, once again, extends beyond the core IT cybersecurity component that is often, 80 to 90% of third-party risk assessments. Are they living up to their obligations? Are they meeting their SLAs? Are they performing to, to all the contractual expectations, that you might have set? Having this type of information, housed and executed via some sort of assessment, brought into a single area, provided visibility to everybody internally, everybody singing from the same hymnal, if you will, and using the same data across the organization to make good risk-based vendor renewal decisions or new sourcing and selection decisions. And then finally, risk doesn't end with the simple expiration of a contract. Offboarding and termination presents its own risks. I know we've seen a couple of instances in the industry in the last year or two where offboarded vendors have exposed, critical data of a particular, company, and a large financial services company, This resulted in some compliance violations, which then were, passed on to that organization. So you have to make sure that all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed, if you will, as you're offboarding that relationship, final payments, data destruction, and more. And that can happen through automation and workflow, so that, again, everyone in your organization that needs to know and to manage that process as it comes to an end has the visibility and the risk intelligence they need. And like I said, everything that we do is to address the needs of as many folks in an organization as possible: security, procurement, risk, vendor management, and compliance. That's our view of the lifecycle, and that's kind of how we map to a lot of what Michael talked about today. Next slide, please. That's great. And just to kind of wind up the prevalent part here, our approach to meeting the needs of customers at every stage of a vendor risk lifecycle is built on 3 principles. Number one, it's smart, which means it's data-driven, it's comprehensive, and it adds context, which is a keyword that Michael talked about earlier. We also, as I mentioned, unify the process as well, whether it's the profile, the prioritization, or the response, in a single system that the entire organization can draw from. And then finally, it's prescriptive. So many, orgs that we work with are transitioning out of spreadsheet-based and email-based processes and are looking for, very prescriptive guidance to automate that, from cradle to grave. And that's where Prevalent can really help you, is to leverage our experience, all of our built-in intelligence or recommendations. There's this whole group of experts behind us that can help you design, implement, and then optimize your program on an ongoing basis. So final slide from us, please, Michael. Really at the end of the day, our objective is to help you accomplish, 3 things. First is we give you the data you need to make better risk-based vendor decisions. We'll help you increase the efficiency of your team by knocking down the silos that Michael talked about a little earlier in his presentation. And, partner with us to help evolve and scale your program. It's not a one and done process. You don't perform due diligence when a vendor's onboarded and let it go. Let us help you kind of manage that all throughout the vendor risk lifecycle. And at the end of the day, we can help you grow that level of maturity, apply the principles that Michael has talked about here, and really make it practical and usable on a day-to-day basis. So thanks for your time. Toby, I'll pass it to you.
Thanks, Scott. I always feel a lot smarter after listening to you guys, so thank you. So my name's Toby Emden. Hello, everybody. I'm the Vice President of Product Strategy and Innovation at SecZeta. So SecZeta is a vendor so our product is uniquely positioned to manage the identity lifecycle for third-party users by adopting a risk-based approach to identity management, which is a pretty unique way of looking at things. So why is this important? If you think about how the IT landscape has changed over the last 10 years and some of the new risks that these changes have introduced to the enterprise from a cyber perspective. We've seen the explosion of a mobile workforce, rapid adoption of cloud services that are no longer protected by an enterprise firewall. Workers are using smart devices that are not necessarily managed by the enterprise anymore. So it's no coincidence that the rise we've seen in the number of cyber breaches and the impact of those cyber breaches over the last decade is kind of concurrent with the number of new risk vectors that have opened up. So all of this change has really eroded the notion of perimeter-centric security controls, which has really forced organizations to adopt a cultural shift in mindset to how they approach cybersecurity, which in the past has been primarily driven not by risk, but by ease of doing business and enabling the business, which is kind of upside down if you think about it. So what this has led to is the notion of what's widely being described as a zero trust security model, which I'm sure a lot of people have heard about over the last couple of years. This is really a way of replacing the perimeter-centric approach to cybersecurity, which was, much more of a free-for-all because you had this sense of security while you were sitting behind that firewall, and you didn't really have to worry so much about who had access to what and what they were doing with that access. But zero trust security is based on users being able to demonstrate minimal risk to the organization before they are granted access to sensitive data assets, such as PII, NPI, financial data, and so on. And no group of users presents a higher risk than third parties. Right. You have some level of assurance with employees because they go through background checks, like financial and criminal background checks and so on. They're part of an HR onboarding process, and that doesn't really apply to third-party users in a lot of cases. So this means a couple of things. The requirement of zero trust to constantly revalidate users and the risk they present to the organization means that your traditional identity and access management solutions are becoming more important than ever, right? So they have to reflect the quantification of risk in how they're granting access to sensitive data, what they're granting access to, and the context of the risk that a user presents to the organization. So what do I mean by contextual risk? It's if you think about the different ways that users can come into the network or access a cloud service nowadays, they can be working from any geolocation using any device. They may have demonstrated suspicious behaviors that could flag them as a potential threat to the organization. None of those contexts are traditionally, none of those contextual factors, I should say, are typically evaluated when granting access to information assets. So evaluating that inherent contextual risk that a user presents and rather than what static privileges they've been assigned is driving a much more risk-centric approach to identity. And this convergence of identity and risk does require a lot of rethinking for organizations because identity and risk are functions that typically don't interact in most companies. So this is where SakeZeta comes in. Over the years, I've advised hundreds of organizations on cybersecurity and identity strategy. And I would say probably less than 5% of them have had an effective means of managing the identity lifecycle, the onboarding, reassignment, and offboarding for third-party users, which, is kind of staggering when you think about the risk implications of that. In fact, most companies don't even have a source of truth or an authoritative source to know who all their third-party users are, never mind what they should be able to access. So our solution uniquely provides the ability to not only manage the identity lifecycle for these populations, but to do so in a way that continuously quantifies risk throughout that life cycle, right? Because risk is not static. It's constantly changing based on contextual and inherent factors. We also manage the relationships between vendors, between users and vendors, and between individual users as part of that risk model. And finally, we act as an authoritative source for all of these populations, provide a consistent way of managing them using a very sophisticated workflow capability, and generate actionable risk data that can be acted upon by existing security tools and solutions, such as, for instance, an identity governance and administration tool. So that's the very brief overview of what we do. I know we're running very short on time, so I'll cut this short and hand it back to the panel.
Hi there. Hi, everyone. You know what? I know that we're right on top of the hour here. I have a poll question once more, of a bit of a pulse check. For the ones that put in questions, we have really great ones. If you want to put in the chat that you want to stick around, we're happy to answer them or take it offline. Maybe put like a 1 in the chat to say that you'll stick around a couple of more minutes. But for right now, we have a few questions and we'll keep on going because it'll be recorded and hopefully we'll get them answered for you. But stick around if you can, that would be amazing. So the first question is, do you foresee a move away from connected devices and smart homes as more and more people get clued up to the huge invasions of privacy they cause, for also end facilitation of burglaries on an epic scale, in parentheses? It's probably for Michael because these all came through while he was talking.
I think that's wishful thinking. The idea of the interconnected home and everything like that is just growing right now. I don't think you're going to see people switching off their smart TVs and devices. And my exercise bike behind me is connected to the internet. I can download exercise videos and access live videos and things like that. I know there's some, on the more zealot side that would like to see us lock things down. But the way the world's going is going to be the other direction. We're going to be more connected. I don't think there's any escaping that. And we need to learn how to secure and deal with that, because that is what the future holds.
Perfect. Another question is, the Internet of Medical Things is a growing area. How can we use the products that the organization's presenting today provide to mitigate issues and manage who and what has access to our network with regards to Internet of Medical Things?
I mean, again, that's going to require very careful security and scrutiny. I'd like to think that as the Biden executive order on cybersecurity moves forward, that we're going to see stronger security within products and validation of that. But we'll have to see how all that plays out. I mean, I was a big part of Bush's national strategy to secure cyberspace back in 2003, wasn't it? I mean, I was on the ISSA International Board of Directors of the VP of Standards and Public Policy, and was involved in providing insight and feedback into that strategy. And before Bush, I mean, Clinton had his, and then after Bush, I mean, Obama had his. So I will have to see what the Biden one brings. But there needs to be, proper security and controls. Personally, I'm an advocate of what Apple's doing to be able to lock down privacy further and put that more in the hands of consumers. But not only is privacy concerned, we also need to make sure security of these devices are integrated into their overall design and function as well.
Perfect. Next question. I'm zipping through these, everybody. So thanks for your patience. In the third-party GRC program, do you see the need for a third-party risk management policy?
Most definitely. You need to be able to have, first off, a charter that says how third-party risk is being managed across departments and functions, but also a clear policy that supports that defines what are the different types of third-party risk, what is, how do we categorize and group vendors by risk, what's considered a high-risk exposure, mediate, low, non-risk exposure, how do we do aggregate risk reporting across risks on a relationship. All that needs to be structured.
And here's a very good one that I think. It says, it seems like there's a lot to consider and accomplish for smaller teams. Any tips for SMBs to better manage third-party risks?
Leverage technology, resources. I mean, the problem is this doesn't scale down very well. The burden on a smaller organization is probably even more significant than a larger organization. We know that the cost of a data breach doesn't scale proportionally, that the overall cost of a data breach for a smaller organization per record or size of organization is actually higher from a larger organization. So, I mean, it's unfortunate, but the small organizations have got to be able to address this and do this just like the larger organizations. Mm-hmm. And so I think technology becomes all the more apparent because you have less human capital resources to throw at this. So you need better ways to automate this and also rely on third-party intelligence content in this area.
Yeah, and whoever said that question, I won't shout your name out, but come talk to us because size doesn't matter here. Okay, next question is, my question is in reference to offboarding, specifically for those vendors that have confidential information. If the contract has terminated, how do we get them to ensure our data is secure? Seems like offboarding should be discussed during onboarding.
Oh, most certainly. And return of data, return of equipment and assets, but also the agreement on the disposition of that data, that needs to be clearly defined in contracts so it can be enforced afterwards. I mean, if you don't have that defined, when you terminate, there's no responsibilities. So you need those responsibilities that are defined in the contract that survive the termination of the contract.
Great. And here we go. 2 more. Woo! Rapid round. Microsoft has introduced an EU-based cloud to reduce some third-party risks. Do you think that the UK-based cloud and more localization generally is also on the horizon?
In general, I think that we are seeing that. I don't have enough insight to really comment on that one too much myself.
Okay, no worries. That was an anonymous one, so we can't help you. You didn't give me your name. And then final one is, do you think people are going to start doing more in-house and stop some outsourcing to reduce environmental costs of IT on all the time and to control, and in parentheses, and therefore protect data better?
For some, that might be a strategy, but in general, I just don't see it going that way. for the overall trajectory, but for some organizations that might very well be a strategy and approach.
Yeah. Well, that's perfect. Well, thank you guys all. I see a lot of people stayed, so that's awesome. Thank you again for hearing out those questions. They were all great. It smells like there might be a follow-up webinar in the future because a lot of you had piqued their interest here and had more questions than we obviously were prepared for. But for next time, we are excited to see you guys at the next one. Michael, Toby, Scott, thank you all, gentlemen, for joining us. This session will be in your inbox tomorrow, everybody. Hopefully the ones that stayed for the Q&A got their questions answered and learned something new. But if you guys need anything else, our info is right there. You can do info@prevalent.net and you'll get someone to follow up with you. And anything else, come find us. Until next time, everyone, thanks again. Bye.